Hi, I'm Adam and welcome once again to South Wales Ghost Watch. And on my show we've got regular guest Martin here with us.
Hi.
Hello Martin. And myself. And today we're going to be talking about vampires. Okay. Now, Martin, where do vampires actually come from?
There are a number of strands here. We're very much influenced by the idea that vampires come from Transylvania. But the idea really does come from that sort of tradition. It comes from the whole Balkan area, Romania, Bulgaria, Greece, old Yugoslavia, always made up the old Yugoslavian states. There are elements of vampire stories from North America as well, from Indian legends. But the vampire is a creature that looks like us, but does not behave like humans. So it's a creature of it's an undead. It's not living, it's not dead. So mythology, folk stories, are full of stories about creatures that are out of place, that are not that should be in one state but are in another. And consequently, the vampire legend depends on the idea that the vampire is a threat because it is a creature that does not die, but it is not alive, and it must sustain itself in this world. So the vampire literally suggests, the origin of the word, draining energy from somebody. We use the word emotional vampires. Not all vampires have teeth and are cold. And of course, what's really muddied the waters is the Stephenie Meyer books on vampires. Not that I'm critical of them, but they've got more in common with the old Bram Stoker legend, which we'll talk about later, than we actually people are aware. But they do have an idea that all vampires are supposed to be stunningly handsome and have wonderful sex lives, according to the Breaking Dawn and the New Moon.
Yeah, because that's what they're portrayed in.
They're portrayed in that way. They do have a very strong link with sex, but we'll talk about that later as well.
Okay, I'm looking forward to that. Okay, so before Bram Stoker and the creation of Dracula, which you just mentioned earlier with Bram Stoker, how were vampires perceived?
The original story of vampire deals with a guy called Vlad the Impaler. He was a nobleman who resisted the Turkish invasion, which is sort of like 13th, 14th, 15th century. I can't remember exactly when. And Vlad was not only a fierce warrior, he was a very cruel man. Not only did he fight vigorously in battle, he also managed to mistreat his peasants, and so on. And the legend says that he was so cruel and vicious that people decided that he was not alive or dead, that the blood he spilled he drank, that he used his cruelty, and his cruelty corrupted him. So the true legend of the vampire appears from that position. But the reason why bodies do not decay in the Balkans is because of the nature of the volcanic soil. In Greece, there is a belief that if the body was murdered or something, or had a story to tell, it did not decay. The volcanic soil kept it purified. Within the Greek Orthodox Church, there is an idea that the more pure you are, the quicker your body turns to dust, and the more you have left behind, the more you have to say. So in certain rural areas in Greece, up until recently, when you buried a relative, you basically buried them in the ground, and a few months later you came and dug them up and placed their bones in a crypt. And it was a very emotional experience, and we find that very odd to think about. But the idea, if a body doesn't decay, is that it's still got a message. It's got an overwhelming emotion. And there have been cases where, from the good side of things in Balkan mythology, Balkan ideas, that people have broken down and confessed that they murdered the person because the body hasn't decayed. And there was a lovely story that illustrates how powerful the vampire legend was. During World War II, people's husbands were often away or got killed in battle. And one very attractive young woman became pregnant and didn't want to name, well, she said that her husband came back and was a vampire and they had sex. And that's how she got pregnant. So the vampire legend is talking about something that is out of place, something that is not yet complete, something that is matter out of place. The vampire is something that exists by will, by a need to drink blood. And that's really sort of some of the themes in the vampire legend. In North American Indian mythology, the vampire is a creature that also feeds off the life force and the energy of people. And we all know vampires as well, from not because they have sharp teeth or are very cold, but because they emotionally drain us when we meet them. So there, the vampire refers to somebody who actually steals our life force.
I mean, metaphorically speaking, I mean, you could say that a human could drain the life force of somebody else,
Of course they could.
to bring them down.
Of course they could.
Or
If you were continually told that you are no good, you are lacking confidence, that you are something wrong with you, you will literally feel the life force drained out of you. In therapy, there is, sometimes I have to be careful that a very disturbed or very depressed client doesn't take my energy away as well. So, you know, that's an example.
Okay. So how did the creation of Dracula influence the vampire legend?
Well, let's talk about this on a number of levels. Bram Stoker wrote the book because you can see it as a development of traditions going back to the Frankenstein story, written by Mary Shelley in the 1820s. And you can see a development all the way through to the 1890s when Bram Stoker wrote the book. It was the book he wrote that sold amazingly. And he did write another book about vampire-like creatures called The Lair of the White Worm as well. But Bram Stoker was obviously influenced by folk stories. And we have to put it into context of its historical time. Bram Stoker was very frightened of women who knew what they wanted. The idea was that the new woman who Stoker feared was somebody who wasn't dependent on a man, somebody who was looking after their own pleasure. And the idea behind the Stoker book is largely a fear of women in that nature. Yeah, there is some argument that Bram Stoker actually had a homosexual relationship with Arthur Irving, who helped design the Albert Hall.
Okay, yeah.
And that his fear of his homosexuality made him very anti-female, and that the idea of these, I mean, I'm thinking of these sort of Peter Cushing accounts of vampires, which we'll probably come on to a bit later.
Yes.
Of the very attractive vampire who lures men and bites them, or the very attractive idea of Dracula looking at women and biting them on the neck. The first Dracula film, they banned one of the scenes because they said that was it Peter Cushing who did it?
Peter Cushing, Christopher Lee.
1957. Yeah. Who looked at women in a very lascivious way. So the lure of the vampire is very much sexual as well. It's about somebody who exists outside of good and evil, and somebody who chooses to be themselves. And I would frequently remember when I was about 13 or 14, some of those female vampires definitely affected my idea of sexuality.
Yeah.
And
Well, they were very hot, weren't they?
they certainly were. They certainly were. And they knew what they wanted, and they were in control.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, they knew what they wanted. So you have to link in the vampire legend very much to the sexuality element of it, and that has definite links that goes forward to the modern films. The new Breaking Dawn, things like that.
Buffy, Angel.
Buffy, Angel. They're all ideas there of people free to explore their own desires. And to many societies, that sort of film, that sort of story emerges at a time when society was going through an economic recession. Horror films and interest in vampires, werewolves and so on always seems to arise when we're in the middle of an economic recession.
Okay.
Whether that makes Margaret Thatcher a vampire, I wonder.
That's where the influences come from, yeah.
Possibly, whether she's come back or not.
Okay, so how do you think vampires have influenced film and TV? We've got Nosferatu of the 1920s. Yes. We've got Dracula, which you mentioned, with Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee. We've got The Lost Boys as well, a modern day 80s vampire film.
Yes.
To more modern day shows like Buffy, Angel, and Supernatural, which is one of your favourites.
Precisely.
Yeah.
The vampire, this film has influenced, has grown out of the Bram Stoker legend, obviously, but the films, he's an aristocrat, yeah? Count Dracula was originally an aristocrat. The women in it are aristocratic, intelligent, beautiful, you know?
Yes.
With, as I said, they choose victims, yeah? If you think in Supernatural, you have the idea that there is one dominant figure who causes the rest to be vampires. Yeah. So you've got the idea that being under the influence of something, it's a bit cult-like. The film enables people to explore the more exciting and sinister world, put a good bit of sexuality into it. The vampires are always the more interesting characters, and I often think the vampire hunters are the most boring. I remember seeing a comedy version of a vampire, like Love at First Bite, where the great Van Helsing's great-grandson was now a psychiatrist in New York, and Count Dracula showed up and was very cultured, very urbane, very sophisticated. So there is something that the vampire is somebody who is outside society, but the Stephenie Meyer's books have introduced the concept of vegetarian vampires, where they don't drink the blood of humans, they just drink the blood of animals. Now, whether that would strictly make them a vegetarian...
Well, it's the same thing, surely.
Indeed.
Yeah.
And I remember a film recently called Daybreakers. It's set in the future where, for some reason...
With Ethan Hawke, isn't it? Yeah.
That's right. Most of the population have been turned into vampires and can't go out during the day. And they keep a few humans alive so that they can harvest the blood. And the humans begin to die off. And there is the idea that there's a metaphor there, there's a myth about the vampire, that the vampire is somebody who's powerful and control, and also scary, sexy, but will always have a thrill and a fear that is difficult for people to understand. It's the unknown. It's somebody who is clearly not human, but appears to be. It's the ultimate nightmare.
Yes.
I think it's Edward in the films argues that the vampire is designed to be the ultimate predator.
Okay.
To be most attractive. Yeah. And I do think there is a very much strong link between attraction, thrill and fear.
Okay, so what can you tell me about the vampire traits and weaknesses such as the pale skin, the fangs, the weakness to garlic, which has arisen in a lot of his films, Holy Water, Daylight, and the crucifixes, which can destroy them?
one of the traditions is, you see, if you think of the Christian link here, the major problem for the church is that the vampire is undead. So the idea is that if you are undead, you do not need personal salvation. So you are beyond the pole of the church. But by being beyond the need for salvation, effectively in Christian terms, of the need of salvation from sins, the vampire is in fact cheated, because the vampire has done something that only according to the Christian mythology, that one person did, Jesus Christ. So the vampire has effectively risen from the dead, and is therefore a terrible frightener to the church. The idea that the vampire can be turned by the cross is probably a legend that originates with Bram Stoker. Because looking at this, you would have to say that North American Indians don't get rid of vampires by brandishing crosses at them, because when the legends originated there was no Christian church. It's something that's convenient. Holy water has effectively been charged with power to cast out wrong thoughts. So the reason it's thrown is it's supposed to burn the vampire. The vampire also is a creature that wakes at night and sleeps during the day. So the very reason that sunlight touches it and damages it is because it is a creature that is more linked to the primal night than the day. That probably links it in very strongly with Roman, Greek myths about that world that existed at night.
And that's where Bram Stoker's influences came from.
And that's very strongly where Bram Stoker's influence. The Fangs are a case of, I've never heard of, the idea is that the vampire bites with the fang, then sucks the blood.
Yeah.
There have been cases where people have actually found sharp teeth, but probably that may well simply be an evolutionary throwback.
Okay.
You know, it's something that is looking at people who stand outside. The coldness is linked very much to the idea of not having a soul. But I think it's very interesting that they then link in these vampire link with sexuality, and sexuality is largely a creation of warmth and support rather than coldness.
Yes, yes.
So the vampire is probably seen as a person who uses somebody.
As somebody who was dominating.
Who's dominated, yes.
Yeah.
And that might be something that needs to be looked at.
Okay.
I mean, generally the vampire is a very powerful emotion, a very powerful legend. And when I think of films like The Lost Boys.
Yes, The Lost Boys, these classic
And
80s films.
Vampires become bikers.
Yes.
Yeah. Perhaps the idea of the external locked out of society threat. Yeah. When I was growing up, we had this fear of greasers, who were guys who went round in leather on motorbikes. Yeah. And I suspect probably the vampire legend is something about the excluded. Yeah. There is a brand of literature during the 19th century called Gothic literature, and it's all about castles and ghosts and vampires and such things like that. And these fed into all of these films, the Gothic story. The reason they became interested in this was because the world was seeming to be explained by science, yet there was a continual craving to look for the unknown, the things that couldn't be explained. And the vampire is a pretty exciting figure. And I'm sure that next week when we talk about werewolves, we'll actually think about how these two groups, link in.
Yes.
How they're very much powerful, particularly because of the New Moon trilogy. You've got this competition between vampires and werewolves, and I won't say much about them there, but the idea of confrontation and battle between different groups is a mirror of how people are, of the unknown, of the unpredictable. Elliot O'Donnell, who wrote lots of stories in the 20s and going back before that, actually wrote about hauntings by werewolves, insisting that the vampire was a haunting in the classical sense.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you have the idea of somebody who is powerful, who deals with what they want, who sucks the energy out.
And they're rebellious as well. They have a rebellious nature.
They can't read. The church doesn't need them.
They're not welcome in society.
They're not welcome in society.
I mean, there seems to be a general theme with vampires of demonic possession, sex, blood and death.
Yes.
Would you agree entirely with that?
Well, I think lots of young boys would like to be a vampire because they could zoom around and they could fly, they could become invisible.
Or turn into bats.
And turn into bats, and they could observe, go to places where they didn't want to go, were powerful figures, and so on. So the vampire is probably attractive to males and females in different sorts of ways. I dare say there's probably even some gay vampires as well, by that sort of argument would be attractive. But the idea of the vampire is extremely powerful, is amoral rather than immoral. It's something that exists outside of society. And going back to characters as Wuthering Heights, Heathcliff, who is Cathy's lover, who's angry and an outsider. He is the dark figure. Vampires fulfill the dark threat out there in the dark coming at us, the threats we don't know about. The threat of being losing control, being dominated by people.
Okay. What makes vampires so popular then, do you think?
Very largely because we live in an age where we're trying to rationally explain everything, and we have this massive build-up of vampires over the last 200-300 years, going all the way back to the legends of the Balkans, all the way through to Bram Stoker, all the way through the ideas of New Moon and so on, and also the idea of how, like the Lost Boys, they're the ultimate biker gang. They're a group of people on the outskirts of society.
And it targets so many different audiences as well.
And it appeals to people in many different ways. Yeah. There is the tradition of vampires not being handsome. There is the Nosferatu. There is the misshapen vampire. And I noticed that in that film Daybreakers that I talked about earlier, if the vampires didn't get blood, they became to a more primal creature that was hideous and threatening. And, you know, as somebody who is a vegetarian, I sometimes know that I'm clearly not a vampire, because if I accidentally ever eat something that is meat, do I taste the blood? And I'm repulsed by it. So clearly I'm not a vampire.
Well, on that note, Madam, thank you very much for coming on the show. As always, it's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.
And that's all we've got time for tonight, guys. But thanks very much for tuning in. And tune into next week's show, where we'll be progressing and we'll be talking about werewolves. That should be interesting. Okay, well, thanks very much from me. Take care. Have a good night.